Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of The Citizen Exclusive with your host, Mpoki Thompson. Today's episode is a special one. I am with the President of Finland, Alexander Stubb. He is in Tanzania on an official state visit. He had dialogue, engagement with the President, Samia Suluhu Hassan, and also other government officials. And today's discussion is going to focus on bilateral relations between Tanzania and Finland, and also Africa and East Africa in particular. Alexander, welcome to the Citizen Exclusive.
Thank you.
And welcome to Tanzania.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so you've engaged with the government and also other state officials who met with the delegation as well. That meeting was chaired by President Samia Suluhu Hassan. I want us to focus more on a domestic approach. Tanzania-Finland bilateral relations, specifically when it comes to trade. We're celebrating 60 years of bilateral relations this year. However, when we look at the trade relations between our two countries, it remains relatively low. Now, I believe part of your discussion with the government is how to enhance trade between the two countries. So particularly in that specific area, what is being discussed in terms of how to boost direct trade between our two countries?
Well, I mean, I will give you two answers. The first one is to say that I don't think it's governments that kind of do trade. It's companies that trade between each other. So we kind of create the conditions,
Yes.
We might have bilateral agreements or something. Second one is that as far as trade is concerned, in its more traditional sense, Finland is a member of the European Union,
Yes.
much like, Tanzania is a member of the EAC. So this means that trade goes through that. So what I try to do here on the trip is, to bring a business delegation. We have 10 Finnish companies, and hopefully then they will increase the trade between our two countries.
Okay, now speaking about the fact that it is actually the private sector, the companies that do facilitate trade through associations such as the Trademark East Africa, your government is enabling Finnish companies establish themselves in Tanzania, but also the wider East African community. Now, what is the opportunity for Tanzanian East African companies also gaining access to the Finnish market, but also the wider EU market? Are there any special incentives for that?
Yeah, I mean, the starting point, of course, is that the European Union should be looked at as one entity. So we should, at least in theory, have free movement of goods, services, labor, and money. And we also have the same currency, in other words, the euro. Sometimes the EU seems a bit cumbersome in terms of market access, but just have faith and work hard on it, and you'll be able to penetrate with your companies. My take as a free trader is that we should have as few barriers as possible, and I fully admit that I'm the first one to do that I don't think that Europe is always a fair trader. It tries to be a free trader, and we need to work on that, because I personally think that the future is actually on the African continent.
And more on that. So Tanzania, as a developing market, is a commodity exporting country. So that means we export.
So far, yes.
So far. So that means we export primarily primary goods. But then when we look at the reverse now, what we import from Finland, that is, vehicle parts, machinery. How can we reach at a stage whereby we have that balance where we export value-added goods? What's the discussion around that area?
Well, it's really hard to say, and I think that's what a lot of economists are trying to grapple with right now. And of course, if you look at what the United States is doing with tariffs, it's a similar debate. I mean, how do you deal with it? My personal take is that in an economy, you always have two sets, right? One is services, so that's the value added that you mentioned. Yeah. And the other one is then the manufacture or the raw material for it. Yeah. You always try to find a balance. So in a country like Finland, there are few natural resources that we can use. Forestry is one. We do have mining in terms of minerals, et cetera, et cetera. But then the rest of it has to be in the service industry. And of course, I can't give any advice to what Tanzania should do, but you're very resource rich. Yeah. When it comes, for instance, to rare earth minerals. I've been to some of your mines. And at the same time, you need to make sure that you don't get completely tangled only to those raw materials. Indeed. I give an example of a country that, in my mind, hasn't developed for centuries, and that's Russia. Russia is way too resource heavy, and that means that it hasn't had enough innovation. So don't bank only on the minerals and resources. be innovative yourselves.
Okay. So no, but part of the discussion between the Tanzanian government and Finland is collaboration around digital economy, but also artificial intelligence, which that is the future.
Yeah.
Now, but there is a concern that developing countries do not have a voice when it comes, for example, to governance on the tech governance. During your collaboration with the Tanzanian government, how do you ensure that there is that more hard voice or a space for Tanzania, for Africa, in terms of tech governance at a global stage?
Yeah. I actually, before I answer, I think that should be viewed more broadly. I think the world order is changing, and I think the world does not reflect what it was like in 1945. It's completely different. That's why I think that the global south should have much more agency and ownership in the order as it exists. Now, putting that aside, two answers on tech. One, if you don't have the infrastructure to use technology, if, for instance, 4G or 5G is too expensive, then that puts you at a disadvantage. So we need to work to be sure that we can create the infrastructure for technology. Second point is on artificial intelligence and in general, you always have to try to be ahead of the curve. So, first in the 1990s, it was about mobile phones. Then Europe was ahead. Then in the 2000s, it was about digitalization. The United States was ahead. And then in the 2010s, it became about artificial intelligence, and then the US and China were ahead. Okay, yeah. I think the next step is actually going to be in quantum computing. So you need, the data in general, then you need to be able to condense that data and use it somehow. And that's when quantum computing and quantum computers come in. And I think this is a great area that we can work on together. And I think we should continue that endeavor.
Yeah. So now part of the concern has been that while the rest of the world have this gradual progression, Africa has found itself whereby we are sort of taking leaps.
Yeah.
Now, how do we mitigate these dynamics in this developed world? How is that going to be very feasible and impactful?
Yeah. I mean, it's tough because sometimes what happens in these kinds of major leaps forward is that discrepancy grows and society becomes more unequal. So you have the haves and have-nots. So you have to make sure that you have an allocation of resources where it's better. Second, I actually think it's good news because that means that Africa is less dependent on raw materials, that you can use digitalization on the continent and in specific countries for development. But there's no magic bullet except one thing. You've got demography on your side. You've got young people. Let the young people lead, because the startups are the ones that drive innovation. It's not us oldies that say, well, I think we should do this. It's the youngsters who say, hey, you old guy, I think this innovation would be quite good, don't you think? And then you look, yeah, that's quite good. So, let empower the young people. I think that's a good message to have.
Okay. Now, and what are some of the lessons that Tanzania, East Africa, and Africa can learn from a country like Finland that is technologically advanced when it comes to leveraging the demographic dividend? Because oftentimes we talk about the demographic dividend, but when you look at the youth in Africa, most of them are unemployed. So that creates a sort of frustration for them. But we're looking at them as a resource for the future, human capital. Yeah. So how can we ensure that we upskill them in a very consistent way so that at the end of the day, that demographic dividend may actually pay out?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two ways to look at it. I think in today's world, we should look more at reverse mentorship, which means that it's not the old in the village, like myself, who sits with all the wisdom. It's the youngsters who tell me how to take, the world forward. And then my second advice is that a liberal democracy is always better than an autocratic system because it is able to correct itself. Now, the problem with liberal democracy today is that it doesn't always deliver pitch perfect results. It actually never does. And right now, I think the biggest threat to democracy is a youth which has an education but no vision or opportunity about future life. So that means that the oldies need to create the conditions in a society whereby if you have an education, you also have a job. Because a job not only gives you income, but it also gives you meaning. And it's always about finding the right balance. So, having a good demographic curve can be both an opportunity, but also occurs if you don't solve it.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Now let's look at the global dynamics. At one of the speeches that you gave at the United Nations General Assembly last year, you talked about the division that is happening rapidly in the world and the erosion of multilateralism. We're looking at agencies such as the United Nations and the role that it plays today. How effective is it as a unit to solve the global challenges? You expressed a level of dissatisfaction with the way the world is being governed. So can you just share with us your sentiments a bit more?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, if the UN didn't exist, it would have to be invented. So it is still the core of peace, I think, where 193 nations come together, at least in theory, as equals to try to solve world problems. I think the big problem with the UN is that its power structure still lives in the past. It hasn't been able to reform itself. And that's why in New York, I proposed that if we want to maintain multilateral cooperation in a world of, multipolar conflict, we have to divide the power in the institution better. And my concrete proposal was to say that we need to increase the number of the UN Security Council from 5 to 10, and in that we need to give at least 1 seat to Latin America, 2 to Africa, and 2 to Asia. Because the UN Security Council was created in the image of the victors of World War II in 1945. And that's not the world we live in anymore. And if we want to preserve multilateralism where the global south has power, then we have to reform the institutions.
Yeah, now in line with that, with increasing the permanent UN Security Council seats and also involving Africa within that special setting, you mentioned the fact that you disagree with the veto that is also in existence. Now, how confident are you of such a proposal passing in today's world, considering the geopolitics?
Well, I mean, realism is not what I'm concerned about when I make big proposals. I try to shake up. I think one of the fundamental problems of the United Nations is that countries in the UN Security Council have veto power. That means that you're always moving, not only at the lowest common denominator, but the denominator defined by one of the 5 states. Okay, I admit it, France and the UK, they don't use their veto. But China, the United States, and Russia do. So that's why I proposed that we scrap the veto. And not only that, if a country blatantly is against the rules of the UN Charter, as Russia right now is in its war of aggression in Ukraine, then you suspend their voting rights. I think this would be fair.
Okay. Now, in line with that, you also expressed the fact that the global South does not really have any voice when it comes to the global narrative or decision-making at a global level. Perhaps what are some of the suggestions that will ensure that Africa and the developing world is also heard when it comes to important matters of global concern?
You need to change the power structure in the global institutions. And by that, I mean the United Nations, as I just said, then the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. If you give power, therefore agency, then you have ownership. If you don't give that, you feel that someone else is imposing the decisions on you. That's why I think that the Global South should be given agency in all of these institutions. And not only that, therefore they will be the ones who decide the next world order. And I think it'll take about 5 to 10 years for it to happen. But this means that the Global South also has to take leadership.
Yeah, indeed. So you've put a timeline of about 5 to 10 years, but how many countries in the developed world also share your sentiments?
It's hard to say. I can't put a figure on it, but I do think that in the Global South, which in my definition has about 125 countries, it's pretty close to the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. You have a few key swing states, right, that have big impact. India, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia are the small ones, perhaps in the Middle East, Gulf region, UAE and Qatar. In Africa, you talk about countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa. Then in Latin America, you talk about countries such as Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. If they show leadership and agency, I think we might get a new world order. But if they sort of lift their hands up, then we're not.
Yeah, so you mentioned the fact that we're living in a multipolar world, and people say that when the US catches a cold, Africa sneezes, or the reverse. Now, what do you think? Because right now we're facing a financial squeeze in Tanzania, in Africa, due to the changing administration in the US, and also the EU and other international institutions that support Africa's development. So we're now looking inward. I just attended the Africa CEO Forum, and that was part of the conversation. How can Africa integrate trade amongst each other so that to ensure that we do not rely on the Western countries or development partners? What is your view about this financial squeeze that the developing world is facing, and how can we best tackle it?
I think every country in the world is experiencing a financial squeeze, and I don't say this only because I used to be the finance minister of Finland and had to try to balance the budget and reduce our debt. I think this is kind of a state of affairs from now for decades ahead. And then you have to come to the question, what do you do? Well, in my mind, some people are thinking about things too transactionally. So basically just making deals. I think you get much more out of cooperation. So if the economic world order is changing as it is, I think what we need to see is more regional integration. And that's why I'm really glad to see something like the EAC, the East African Cooperation, because that is, a laboratory for integration and cooperation where you bring down barriers.
Yeah.
Now, then you're going to get someone saying, oh, but if I have free trade with Kenya, it's going to be away from Tanzania. I don't think that. It's quite the contrary.
Yeah. So and how did the EU manage to overcome the protectionist approaches? Because that's what we're facing in Africa. When we look at the Continental Free Trade Agreement, there is a lot of protectionist policies that are being put in place.
I wish I could stand here, hand on heart and say that there's no protectionism in Europe, but I would be lying. There's still a whole bunch of protectionists. But I've made it my sort of life job to try to fight protectionism. I come from a small country. We benefit from an open economy, a free trade system, free movement of goods, services, people, and money. So may that be the path forward.
Okay, so in closing, what gives you hope of the world working together and leaders in some of the most powerful countries doing away with protectionist approaches, doing away with concentrating on their own national development and just working all together in a multilateral system?
Because we don't have a choice. I think we live in a time in history where cooperation is more needed than ever before. We cannot solve the climate crisis. We cannot solve demography. We cannot solve migration. We cannot solve conflict. We cannot solve technology if we don't cooperate together.
Well, Alexander, that's the end of this interview. And thank you for being available to have this great conversation.
Thank you for the invitation.
You were with me, Mpoki Thompson, for the Citizen Exclusive. We were with the President of Finland, who has visited Tanzania on a special state visit. Until next time, bye-bye.